Right, so a lot of people have been asking me to make a video on how I make my melodies and how they can write better melodies. So I thought long and hard about this, and I came up with 5 basic ideas that I subconsciously and consciously use to make my own melodies better. Now, before we get started, I want to make a distinction between the 3 main elements of a melody, which are the notes, the rhythm, and the underlying chords. So I'm going to cover these 5 basic ideas that you can apply to all 3 of those elements of a melody. So the first and one of the most important things about a melody is repetition. So if there's no consistency in either the notes, the rhythm, or the underlying chords, then a listener is not going to know what's going on when he first hears your music. So let's take a look at one of my songs called Leave Me, and the melody goes like this. So this melody in particular has a lot of notes, but if you just look at the rhythm and you leave the notes out of it, it sounds like this. So that's actually really repetitive. It's basically all quarter notes, so it doesn't get much simpler than that. So if you keep your rhythm really repetitive and simple and your chord structure as well, then it allows you to play around with your notes and be a little bit more complicated there. So as a rule of thumb, I always use, if you want to get complicated with something, make sure the other elements are very simple and repetitive. All right, so the next thing is variation. If you keep a motif that never changes, it's going to be extremely boring. But if you try to add just a tiny bit of variation, it's going to change everything. So sometimes even changing one note is enough to put enough variation into your motif to keep it interesting. Now, if you have a motif, let's say in C major like this, if you just use the notes within the chord, it's going to be extremely predictable and boring. So the most beautiful kind of variation to me happens when you add notes that are not in the chord. So when you just use some notes to use character and friction, it sounds like this. So another thing you can play around with is keeping your melody simple, but playing around with the underlying chords. So if you listen to a track of mine called Forever, it has an extremely simple and repetitive melody, but I play around with the chords underneath the melody, so that keeps everything interesting. So when you have a basic idea of your motif, you can start playing around with question and answer. And if you have a melody that goes something like this, I believe this is from the movie Ice Age, but it's just a perfect example. That's your question. And that's your answer. So it's actually very simple. You just end your question with whatever note except for the tonic, which is the first note of the scale that you're playing your song in. And then you end your answer with the tonic. And that's going to feel like everything is resolving and it feels like coming home. Now, a more modern approach to this, and this is something that I do all the time myself, would be that you play the question with a certain instrument or vocal chop or synth, and then you follow that with the vocal hook, and that's going to be the answer to your question. And that way you make sure that your song is going to be very catchy because the vocal hook is always going to resolve that instrumental part, and it's always going to feel like coming home whenever that vocal kicks in. All right, so the last thing that I want to add is that really there are no rules. So if you want to make the most annoying melody ever that never resolves to that tonic, I challenge you to pull that off, but also make sure you put your own taste into your melody. So a great way for me to do this is by playing around with the underlying chords, and I, for one, really love diminished chords and how they transition into the next chord, like this. So find out what you're good at, find out what you really like, and that will help you out tremendously. All right, if you liked the video, make sure to subscribe for future videos and leave a comment with suggestions for the next video, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.